continuing with our the topic from last segment, the fourth category of state is what we call the rentier states. These are states that are more than able to meet and satisfy the needs of their population, especially the material needs. And when I say more than satisfy, what that means is that they are meeting almost all their basic material needs and then more. But these states are increasingly feeling the pressure of change coming from the revolutionary tide in the rest of the Arab world. So who are these states? These are mostly states that make up the Gulf Cooperation Council, and they consist of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, the city-state of Kuwait, Qatar, also like a city-state, and the Kingdom of Oman, or Sultanate of Oman. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but before doing that, I want to say a few words about the term rentier state. So rentier states, really it's a theory, and it refers to a situation where the relationship between the states and the citizens are defined by the fact that a large portion of the national income of the country is derived from what is called rents. Rents, they denote those externally generated, oftentimes unproductively earned revenues, such as the proceeds from the sale of oil and gas exports. It also includes income from fees such as charges for transit or transit charges for the shipping or for pipelines, or even for that matter foreign aid. In other words, these are monies that you really are not generating through productive means. You get it because you happen to be lucky to have oil, or you have a strategic area in which there's an oil pipeline that passes. Notice that if you're a rentier state, you will distribute income from the rents to your public, and by having that income to give to your public, one advantage of it is that it frees you from imposing one of the most coercive things that any government does, and that's the power to tax. You can save yourself that trouble by not taxing your citizens to pay for all the government expenses and services. But the fact that you're doing that, it is also relieving pressure on the government to make concessions on power sharing with its citizens, because they could go back and tell the people that you're going to get excellent income, free education, free health, and let us rule and don't demand anymore. The kind of control that is used in the so-called rentier state is something we discussed earlier. It's called the cooptation strategy. In other words, it's a strategy of control that government uses to co-opt its population into compliance. Thus, what you get is that major government the government and the majority of the people, in a sense, are entering into a kind of what I call a Faustian bargain. On the one hand, the regime satisfies all your material needs and educational needs, health needs, and it does so beyond the usual standards, sometimes even exceeding those in the West, thanks to the huge sums of money generated by the rent, such as sale of oil and so on. In exchange for this, for these largesse from the government, the masses are expected to, in a sense, sell their political soul and acquiesce to the ruling elites. So that is the kind of a relationship in the rentier step, the cooptation strategy. Masses their needs are well taken care of, and yet they are politically acquiescent. You would expect normally for this to be a pretty stable system, and yet, thanks to Arab awakening, you're beginning to see chinks in the armor of these regimes. They are beginning to be concerned about what is happening elsewhere in the Arab world, and are deeply fearful that their own population may one day revolt against their rules. Indeed, there are signs of accumulating pressures for some kind of a reform that is spreading to Saudi Arabia and to the Gulf states, and therefore they are not immune to what has happened. In fact, Saudis and many of the Gulf states, with the possible exception of Qatar and Kuwait, they were strongly opposed to the fall of Mubarak because they saw that as very dangerous to their own rule. But the point that I'm trying to make is that even the most secure states that have bought their rules from their population, they too may very well be vulnerable. So that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to say about the lay of the land in the contemporary Arab world. Now I want to return back to the discussion of the Arab world by, if you recall, in the previous segment I started with a map, and I want to talk about the transition to mass politics in the Arab world. So going back to my old map, I will begin with Area 1, the Levant or Greater Syria, to discuss that important transition. Really, until the 20th century, the people of this whole area, not just one, in fact all of that area, but probably the most advanced one was Area 1, the people there until the 20th century identified mostly with clans, with the exceptions of those who were in the few major urban areas. Now, as you begin to approach what I call the rapid change, which really began in the 20th century, and especially the second half of the 20th century, you begin to get a sense of Arabness for some, not all of the people there. You got to remember now that the Arabs are part of the Ottoman Empire, and in the Ottoman Empire there was a millet system in which various, it was a very heterogeneous empire, and there was a great deal of autonomy for the various nationalities, so to speak. So the Ottomans gave the people under their rule quite a bit of autonomy and pretty long leashes. As the change process begins in the area 1 that I mentioned, the Levant, really becomes the core of Arab sense of identity and also Arab nationalism. Initially, change occurs mostly or takes place mostly in the urban areas. So Arab nationalism first occurs in Area 1 rather than these other 3 areas. It's also important to point out that the Jews in the Middle East, the Sephardim Jews, actually lived in all 4 areas, but they were concentrated in Area 1, the Levant, and Area 4, Mesopotamia. Now, also I should point out that in that early period, most of the Jews actually spoke Arabic. Now the question as we approach this change and the rise of sense of nationalism that I mentioned, the question is this: what form or what political structure, if you like, will begin to take shape as Arabs begin to make that transition from pre-mass to mass politics? That is, as Arabs try to enter the modern world, and as Arabs begin to become politically participant, what type of political structure would they be gravitating toward? If the patterns of the past is any guide, it suggests that at this early stage in the development, these people, despite their sectarian, religious, and even ethnic differences, will begin to think of themselves as a nation that deserves and must have a state. So in so many words, I've tried to say something about the rise of Arab nationalism. Now, before I get into that, what I want to do is to engage in a little bit of a theory to show you what I really mean. Notice the heading of this slide is Amalgamation of Identities to Create State. And I want to provide a little bit of a historical perspective. At one end, you have a low intensity in which the identities are not very strong, to amalgamate these, to combine these identities. At the other end, you have a very intense identification. And I put this line here in the middle called the threshold line. So on the left of that is those who have made it, and to the right are those who have not made it. So among those who have made it, the first one are Pan-Germans. You will see that this also includes the Prussians. Pan-German was strong enough to form an amalgamation of identities, various identities, under the leadership of Bismarck. And at the end, when Bismarck was able to unify the Germans, Germany became a very, very nationalistic entity. The second category under those who have actually succeeded would be Italy, and Italians pretty much accomplished the same under Garibaldi and Mazzini. Now on the right are states who may have or could have also made this amalgamation to become a pan-state, a unified state, but simply the divisions were too strong to make it. The first one would be Slavs. When you think about it, the Slavs do have a great deal in common. They have similar culture and languages, and to move toward a pan-Slavic movement seems to be pretty natural. And yet the divisions are simply too great to make that a reality. Two more categories that there is some support for it, but nowhere sufficient to make this a reality would be Pan-Iran and Pan-Turan. Pan-Iran is the unity of all the Persian-speaking people, and Pan-Turan is the unity of all the Turkish-speaking. Pan-Turan, I've put it closer to the threshold line because it seems slightly more viable than Pan-Iran. And then finally, notice where I put Pan-Arab. Pan-Arab is before that threshold. In the 50s, it seems to be almost right at the point of threshold. Today, as you will see and as we will discuss, it may not be there as close to the threshold line. So the question really is, would the Arabs make it? The conclusion that there are very, very intense Arab nationalists has been demonstrated over and again. But will they make it and move beyond the threshold into the categories of having made it? Well, that is a much more debatable proposition. Clearly, some would not want to join. Egypt, for example, in terms of its commitment, even though it's been a leader of the Arab nationalism, in many ways, their commitment to the cause is questionable. So I want to advance a proposition for you as you think about these amalgamations of identities and whether or not they could unite. Think of it this way. A critical variable, but I want to caution you that certainly by no means is the only variable. There are other variables, but a critical one that has prevented Arab unity from becoming a reality from the days of World War I to the present, in my view, has been external intervention. Let me put it this way. During the first 4 decades of the 20th century, the imperial powers had done their utmost to prevent Arabs from uniting. And then, after World War II, the Americans and our Western allies continue to work hard to keep Arabs divided. Today, more than a century later, you must now have to add an additional factor to the external factors that further serves as an obstacle to Arab unity. So the external factor certainly is not the only one, so I'm adding an internal factor. One of those internal factors that I want to focus on is the formation of new identities related to individual Arab states that are also now competing with the pan-Arab identity. In other words, new amalgamations of identities are taking form that are competing with Arab identity rather than complementary. So, are the Syrians more Syrians or Arabs? Are Egyptians more Egyptian or Arabs? Are Iraqis more Iraqis? Are Saudis more Saudis than Arab? So you can see that state identities, such as Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, all of these identities are beginning to compete. And if you're a ruler of any of these countries and are worried about losing your state to some larger entity, the Arab states, the Arab nations, you will certainly promote identification with the states. The problem in this case, however, is this. The borders of most of these countries were ones that were drawn by the imperial power. But then, on the other hand, many years have now passed since those borders were drawn, and therefore people, in a sense, have gotten used to it, and new identities have an easier time accepting these states as legitimate borders. So the point of discussion is simply to suggest that Arabs today are in many ways ambivalent, if not confused, with regards to their identities. And then add to this complicated picture the force of Islam. Islam is now yet another force complicating the identity of the people of this area. What about Pan-Islam, the unity of all the Islamic people? So Pan-Islam originally was way at the low end of intensity, but now it must be pushed right near the threshold line, and as such, you will see that it is competing with Pan-Arabism. Of course, one could always argue with some force that even a favorable international environment may not be enough for Islam to become the basis of state identity. But then one should also remember that there's not that much historical precedence to argue one way or the other, because the Islamic notion of the Ummah, the community of faithful, is very powerful. Let me end by pointing out the changing role of religion. You may recall that Marx talked about religion being opium of the masses. That may have been true in the pre-mass politics, when people were not politically participant. So religion was something the sigh of the oppressed, so to speak, as Marx would put it, the opium of the masses. It allows you to tolerate difficult conditions. In the post-mass politics, religion now has become an instrument, a political instrument, not to really get your rights to be able to participate in politics and to sometimes even monopolize politics. So you can see a big change in religion, the role of religion in pre-mass politics versus post-mass politics, from a passive sigh of the oppressed to an active instrument of revolution.